It was a quiet Wednesday morning when the news broke, flashing across screens and radio waves. Finally, AOC will face criminal charges. For months, rumors had been swirling. From whispers in Capitol Hill to social media threads, everyone knew that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as she was popularly known, had been under heavy scrutiny. But the announcement had always seemed like an impossible reality, until now. AOC had long been a polarizing figure. Her unapologetic progressivism and her fierce stances on everything from climate change to healthcare had made her a lightning rod for controversy. While her supporters cheered her on as a champion of the people, her critics had long claimed she was involved in something far more sinister. Now, it seemed the charges were real. The world was buzzing. News outlets scrambled to get the story. But it was none other than Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi who dropped the bombshell. She had been leading a deep investigation into corruption at the highest levels of Congress, and AOC's name had surfaced repeatedly during the probe. Bondi, known for her tough stance on law and order, appeared before the press, her expression grim but resolute. The press room was packed, everyone eager for the latest details. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bondi began, her voice cutting through the murmur of the room. "Today, I stand before you with a message of great importance. The evidence we have gathered has led us to a point of no return. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will face criminal charges." The room fell silent. Bondi's words hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. "This is not about politics," she continued. "This is about accountability. No one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." It was clear, the gloves were coming off. Bondi had just delivered the final blow. The question on everyone's mind was, what did the evidence reveal? And how would AOC respond? The story was just beginning to unfold, and no one knew where it would lead. As the news spread, the implications of Bondi's announcement began to settle in like an uncomfortable truth. Across the political spectrum, reactions varied wildly, some celebrated, others condemned. But one thing was clear, the public wanted answers. And they wanted them fast. For days, the media was saturated with speculation, snippets of leaked information, and breathless reports. But the real bombshell came when the full details of the investigation were revealed. Bondi's office had managed to uncover a sprawling network of allegations that tied AOC to a shadowy series of financial deals. It wasn't just corruption in the traditional sense, it was something more insidious: money laundering, fraudulent donations, and even whispers of ties to foreign interests. The story grew even more tangled when news broke that AOC had been using her political platform to funnel funds into a series of nonprofit organizations that, on the surface, appeared to be entirely above board. But deeper digging showed that these organizations had been linked to suspicious financial movements, millions of dollars in untraceable donations that seemed to disappear into thin air. The money was moving quickly, like a current, slipping through the cracks, hidden behind layers of legal jargon and bureaucracy. Reports also suggested that AOC had made strategic deals with high-profile donors, including controversial figures from overseas. Some sources pointed to a web of communication with entities that were suspected of trying to influence U.S. policy. Bondi wasted no time in releasing damning footage, hidden camera footage, no less, of meetings between AOC and influential lobbyists. The tapes showed AOC discussing how to secure millions in campaign donations in exchange for favorable legislative actions. The lobbyists on the tapes weren't just any businessmen. Some were tied to international corporations with interests that directly contradicted AOC's public policy stance. As the news flooded in, AOC's office issued a statement. "These allegations are nothing but a smear campaign," it read. "The charges are politically motivated, and we will fight them tooth and nail. We stand with the people." But there was no denying that the evidence against her was piling up. Bondi had made her case, and it was one that left little room for doubt. In Washington, the mood was tense. Democrats scrambled to defend AOC, citing the lack of concrete proof and pushing back against what they called right-wing attacks. Meanwhile, Republicans wasted no time in rallying behind Bondi, heralding her as a hero who was finally holding the radical left accountable. The country was divided, but there was no question that AOC was in the crosshairs. And as the days passed, one question lingered in the minds of everyone watching: would AOC be able to clear her name, or was this the beginning of the end for her political career? The investigation had only just begun, and the truth, whatever it was waiting to be uncovered. As the investigation continued to unfold, the political storm around AOC grew more intense. The pressure was mounting from all sides. News networks had become 24/7 battlegrounds for pundits, analysts, and politicians, all debating the merits of the charges. The air was thick with accusations, with every word spoken twisted into ammunition for the battle ahead. AOC supporters rallied to her defense, flooding social media with hashtags like #SaveAOC and #TruthForAOC. They decried the investigation as an attempt to silence the progressive voice in Washington, to undermine the will of the people. Celebrities, activists, and even fellow Congress members took to the airwaves, calling the charges politically motivated and framing the whole situation as a smear campaign designed to discredit AOC's groundbreaking work. But the cracks in AOC's defense were beginning to show. Bondi, undeterred by the uproar, continued to push forward with her investigation. New leaks and revelations came in almost daily. One report detailed a financial transaction that seemed too clean to be coincidental, a payment of hundreds of thousands of dollars to a company owned by a close associate of AOC. The company, conveniently, had no history of producing anything of value, but it had a remarkable ability to take in large sums of money from sources that were impossible to trace. As the accusations mounted, so did the calls for AOC to step down. Republican leaders, from local state politicians to Senate figures, were increasingly vocal, demanding that she resign from Congress immediately. They argued that the charges were enough to destroy her credibility and that it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. Inside AOC's camp, things were falling apart. There were whispers of fractures within her team. Some of her closest allies, once confident in her innocence, were beginning to question whether they could continue to stand by her. The tapes, the financial documents, the undeniable connections, all of it was a heavy burden. But AOC refused to back down. "Do you really think they're going to take me down?" she told one of her top advisors in a private meeting, her voice fierce with defiance. "This is bigger than me. It's about the movement. They want to silence us, but they're not going to get away with it. I'll fight this until my last breath." But there was a growing sense that the tide was turning against her. With every new piece of evidence, her position seemed more untenable. And in the halls of Congress, the whispers were becoming louder, voices that had once supported her progressive agenda now muttering that they couldn't afford to be associated with the scandal. Pam Bondi, meanwhile, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, collaborating with federal investigators, financial experts, and former insiders. She knew that the key to bringing AOC down would be finding a smoking gun, something irrefutable. And after weeks of digging, it seemed she had found it. The night before Bondi was set to make her next public statement, a final revelation came to light, a series of encrypted emails between AOC and a prominent international figure, one whose business dealings with foreign governments were already under intense scrutiny. The emails suggested that AOC had been coordinating with this figure on legislation that directly benefited his interests, all while keeping the deals under wraps. The bombshell hit the following morning. Bondi, with a grim smile, appeared before the press again, this time holding up the evidence that could end AOC's political career for good. "The truth is undeniable now," Bondi said. "We have the proof. This is not just a case of political maneuvering, it's a case of illegal, unethical behavior that puts the interests of foreign entities ahead of the American people." The press conference set off a firestorm. AOC's critics pounced, while her supporters scrambled to defend her, claiming the emails were fabricated or taken out of context. But one thing was certain, this was the moment that would determine AOC's future. Would she be able to weather the storm, or had Bondi delivered the final blow that would bring her down for good? The final stage of the drama had arrived. As AOC stood in the eye of a political hurricane, the tension in Washington reached a boiling point. The media circus intensified, and the national spotlight was fully fixed on her, the pressure on both sides so extreme that it felt as if every move she made could either cement her place in history or send her crashing into disgrace. On one side, you had Pam Bondi, relentlessly gathering support from both conservative and moderate circles. Her determination was unyielding. With each piece of evidence she unveiled, she strengthened her position as the figurehead of justice. Bondi's sharp, no-nonsense approach was galvanizing her base, and in her mind, this was more than just a political battle, it was a moral crusade to restore integrity to a system she believed had been corrupted by figures like AOC. On the other side, AOC was backed into a corner. The charges stacked against her were damning, and the public had seen enough to question her once untouchable image. But she wasn't finished yet. If there was one thing AOC had made clear during her time in office, it was that she was a fighter. And when the world seemed ready to turn its back on her, she dug in her heels and went on the offensive. She stood before the cameras, resolute, refusing to bow to the mounting pressure. Her voice, though strained, was steady as she made her case. This is not about me. This is about something bigger. This is about silencing those who fight for the working class, for healthcare, for justice, she declared. These charges are nothing more than an attempt to take down the progressive movement. I've dedicated my life to making sure the voices of the marginalized are heard. And no matter what they throw at me, I will not back down. Her words sparked another wave of protests and rallies, her supporters flooding the streets, chanting her name, demanding justice. But the cracks were deepening, and her base was no longer the unified front it once was. Whispers began circulating that some of the most loyal members of her inner circle had been talking behind closed doors, some even questioning the extent of her involvement in the scandal. The pressure was starting to break through, and a political reckoning was on the horizon. Days later, in a shocking turn of events, a special hearing was called, bringing AOC face to face with the accusations that had haunted her for months. The hearing was unlike anything Washington had ever seen, an intense, high-stakes showdown between the fiery, impassioned representative and a team of seasoned prosecutors and investigators, led by none other than Pam Bondi herself. As AOC took her seat at the table, the weight of the moment was palpable. All eyes were on her. She had been accused, tried in the court of public opinion, and now she was about to face the full force of the legal system. Would she be able to clear her name, or was this the end? Bondi opened the proceedings with a cold, precise statement, her eyes never leaving AOC. We have the evidence. We have the witnesses. We have the smoking gun. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has used her position to enrich herself, to manipulate the system, and to compromise the integrity of American democracy. The facts are irrefutable, and she must be held accountable for her actions. The room fell silent as AOC's defense team scrambled to refute the accusations, presenting counter-evidence, alleging that the emails were forged, and claiming that the tapes were selectively edited. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Bondi had positioned herself as the victor in this battle, and her confidence radiated. But AOC wasn't about to roll over. She leaned forward, her gaze unflinching as she addressed the committee. You can accuse me of anything you want. But I will not stand here and allow you to use my name to distract from the real issue. The system is broken, AOC fired back, her voice filled with fire. And if taking me down is your answer to that, then you are only proving what I've been saying all along, that this system protects the corrupt and punishes the innocent. I may have made mistakes, but I will not be your scapegoat. The committee was divided. Some members, seeing the fervor in AOC's defense, seemed to waver in their judgment. But as more evidence was presented, the narrative against her became clearer. The ties to foreign entities, the questionable financial transactions, and the secret meetings all painted a damning picture. As the hours stretched on, Bondi's final blow came. A previously undisclosed email surfaced, one that AOC herself had sent, outlining a specific strategy to bypass legal regulations for personal gain. The message was clear and direct: AOC had knowingly committed actions that violated both the public's trust and the law. With that, the hearing adjourned, and the decision was made: AOC would face charges. The details of the indictment were to be finalized in the coming days, but one thing was certain: the battle was over. For now, the political world held its breath. Would AOC be able to fight back, or was this the final chapter in the rise and fall of a political star? The aftermath of the hearing would leave an indelible mark on both AOC's career and the future of progressive politics in America. The storm wasn't over, but the winds had shifted, and the stakes were higher than ever. In the days following the hearing, the political landscape in Washington, D.C. was transformed. The finality of AOC's indictment rippled through the media, shaking the foundations of progressive politics in America. Her supporters, once unwavering, now found themselves caught in a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and confusion. The question everyone was asking: could their once iconic representative really be guilty of the crimes she was accused of? The national mood was charged. The air felt thick with the weight of what had just happened. The media circus went into overdrive, with commentators on both sides of the aisle calling for AOC's resignation and demanding that she face the full consequences of her actions. The left, still holding on to hope, tried to spin the narrative as one of political persecution, but it was clear that the tide was turning. More and more of her colleagues in Congress, who had once stood firmly by her, began to distance themselves. The press was unforgiving, throwing AOC's name into the dirt with headline after headline: the fall of a progressive icon, from champion of the people to criminal defendant, AOC's legacy in tatters. AOC's public appearances became fewer, and when she did speak, it was only in carefully crafted statements designed to control the damage. She maintained her innocence, of course, but the cracks were showing. In private, the toll of the situation was visible. Her staff was fragmented, some already talking to the press in hushed tones about their doubts, while others dug their heels in, holding on to the belief that AOC could still redeem herself. Her defense team was working overtime, scrambling to keep up with the constant stream of new revelations. But the prosecution, led by Bondi, was relentless. Each day, more pieces of evidence fell into place, hard facts that couldn't be easily dismissed. The emails, the financial transactions, the secretive meetings, it all painted a picture that was hard to ignore. And then came the final blow. AOC's campaign was forced to release her financial records, something she had vehemently fought against for months. What they revealed was damning: a series of transactions and donations that not only violated campaign finance laws but also showed a deliberate effort to cover up illegal financial activities. The money trail was undeniable, and it ran deep. The image of AOC that had once been that of a fearless crusader for justice was now tainted by suspicion and scandal. People who had once called her a hero now viewed her as the embodiment of the very corruption she had once railed against. The trust she had worked so hard to build over the years was shattered. As the criminal charges against her mounted, the weight of the situation became too much to bear. AOC knew that the political machine had already moved on, and her days in office were numbered. The internal pressure was reaching a breaking point. Calls for her to resign came from all corners of the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans alike. Even some of her closest allies had turned their backs on her, unwilling to defend a figure who was now so entangled in scandal. In the middle of all this chaos, AOC made a final, dramatic decision. In a tear-filled press conference, she announced that she would step down from her seat in Congress, acknowledging the gravity of the charges against her. She expressed regret for the mistakes she had made, but maintained that she had never intentionally broken the law. "I made decisions that I thought were in the best interest of the people I serve," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "But I also understand that the actions I've taken have consequences, and I must face them. I will not let this cloud the work of the movement I've spent my life building." Her resignation sent shockwaves through the political world. For many, it marked the end of a tumultuous chapter in American politics. AOC's rise had been meteoric, and her fall just as swift. In a country where political figures were often given second chances, the cold reality was that some reputations were irreparably damaged. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, stood victorious. Her role in bringing down one of the most prominent figures in progressive politics was seen by many as a triumph of justice. While some still questioned the fairness of the entire process, the facts were irrefutable. AOC had been brought to justice, and her political career was over. But the story didn't end there. The fallout from the case would continue to reverberate through the corridors of power in Washington for years to come. New questions about the influence of money in politics, the growing power of lobbyists, and the corruption in Congress would dominate the national conversation. And while AOC's fall was a victory for some, it served as a reminder to the American people of the fragility of power, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. The last image of AOC before the cameras turned off was one of a woman torn between defiance and regret, standing at the edge of a political abyss she couldn't escape. The days that followed AOC's resignation were anything but quiet. Washington, D.C., a city already teeming with the noise of politics, now buzzed with an even more intense fervor. The once unstoppable progressive leader had been brought down, and the reverberations were being felt far beyond the halls of Congress. On the surface, it appeared that AOC's fall was swift, final, and absolute. But beneath that, a simmering undercurrent of debate continued to grow. Was AOC truly guilty, or had she been made a scapegoat? Had the system betrayed her, as she had always claimed, or had she simply been caught in a web of her own making? These questions hung in the air, unanswered and unresolved. Pam Bondi, now hailed as a hero to many, was thrust into the spotlight even further. Her rise in prominence seemed inevitable. She became a symbol of what many saw as the last bastion of accountability in a political system mired in scandal. Conservative circles celebrated her efforts, lauding her as someone who wasn't afraid to take down even the most formidable figures when they stepped out of line. But even Bondi knew that victory in this case had come at a cost. As the weeks passed, the heat turned on her, too. Critics, particularly from the progressive side, began to question the methods used in the investigation. Had it been a fair trial, or had AOC been the victim of a partisan witch hunt? Allegations of political bias began to circulate, fueled by AOC's die-hard supporters, who continued to insist that the charges were exaggerated, if not completely fabricated. The media remained split. On one hand, AOC's fall was seen as a necessary cleansing of corruption from the highest echelons of power. On the other, it sparked a larger conversation about the dangers of a system where even the most vocal reformers were vulnerable to being silenced. Documentaries and exposés were already being produced, some painting her as a martyr, others as a cautionary tale of ambition gone wrong. AOC herself, once the face of the future of American politics, had largely retreated from the public eye. In the months following her resignation, she made only a handful of public appearances, each one more subdued than the last. She had been offered lucrative book deals and speaking engagements, but she turned them down, choosing instead to focus on her personal life and what she could rebuild, if anything, from the wreckage of her career. But she wasn't gone for long. In a surprise move, AOC made her first major public statement since her resignation. Standing before a crowd of supporters and critics alike, she acknowledged the charges and the mistakes she had made. She didn't back down from her earlier claims of being targeted by political enemies, but she admitted that there were areas in which she could have acted differently. "I will not pretend that I am innocent of everything. I was not perfect, and I made mistakes," AOC said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I will also not let this define me. What I've learned from this is that no one is above the system we've built, and no one is immune from the consequences of their actions." The room was silent as her words settled in. Some of her supporters cheered, while others remained skeptical. The damage to her reputation was undeniable, but AOC was not ready to disappear entirely. She had been knocked down, but not broken. In the following months, her public image began to shift. She stayed out of the immediate political spotlight, but her name continued to appear in discussions about political reform and corruption. Some saw her as a cautionary example, others as someone who had fought for the right causes but got caught in a system that crushed those who challenged the status quo. While some of her political allies tried to rebuild their own careers, now tainted by their association with her, AOC began to quietly rebuild her base, focusing on grassroots activism. She worked with advocacy groups, pushing for reform in the areas that had first brought her to prominence. Healthcare, climate change, and economic equality remained her causes, but she now spoke of them with a sense of understanding and humility that had been absent before. Meanwhile, Bondi's star continued to rise. The charges against AOC had secured her position as a powerful figure in conservative circles, and she was courted for higher office. Whispers of a Senate run grew louder with each passing day. But Bondi was careful. She knew that while she had won the battle, the war was far from over. There were many who had been critical of her methods, who saw her as someone willing to sacrifice fairness for political victory. She would need to tread carefully, making sure that the next chapter of her career was carefully written. As for the rest of Washington, life continued in its usual chaotic rhythm. The scandal had caused a temporary disruption, but politics was resilient. New figures began to rise, taking advantage of the power vacuum left by AOC's fall. But in the minds of many, her name remained synonymous with a moment in history, an example of both the triumphs and the tragedies of American politics. The story of AOC, and the devastating charges that led to her downfall, was now etched into the political narrative of the 21st century. Whether she would ever regain her former prominence, or whether she would go down in history as a tragic figure, only time would tell. But one thing was certain, her legacy, for better or worse, would never be forgotten. The months passed, and the fallout from AOC's resignation continued to echo through Washington and beyond. While the media had shifted its focus to other scandals and political dramas, the story of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez lingered in the public consciousness. Her rise had been meteoric, and her fall, just as swift. But now, in this final chapter, the legacy of her political journey was beginning to crystallize, both a warning and a lesson for the generations that would follow. AOC's political career, once a symbol of hope and change, had been irrevocably altered by the charges that had shattered her public image. Though she had publicly acknowledged her mistakes and stepped away from the limelight, whispers of her name continued to circulate in the halls of power. The impact of her downfall was far-reaching, both in the sense that it exposed the cracks in the political system and in how it became a rallying cry for those who believed that the system was broken. Despite her departure from the stage, AOC's influence was far from gone. Her grassroots movement continued, but in a quieter, more subdued form. Her supporters, now fewer in number but still passionate, rallied behind local issues, organizing protests and pushing for legislative changes at the state level. The momentum for progressive reform remained, albeit without the shining figurehead she had once been. They fought for what she had preached, a system that prioritized people over profit, equality over division, and action over empty rhetoric. But AOC herself was no longer the figure at the forefront. After stepping away from politics, she chose a quieter path. She relocated to a small town in New York, seeking a sense of peace and normalcy after years of public scrutiny. For the first time in a long while, she lived without the constant pressure of being watched, of being the face of a movement that had both uplifted and ultimately undone her. She worked on a book, not about politics, but about the lessons she had learned, the mistakes she had made, and the future she still believed was possible. Her book, The Cost of Change, became a quiet but powerful manifesto. Not a defense of her actions, but an honest reflection on the system she had fought to dismantle, and ultimately, the one that had dismantled her. It was a raw and unfiltered account of her rise and fall, filled with cautionary tales and deep insights into the murky world of political corruption, ambition, and the unyielding pressure to succeed. Some hailed it as a brave and necessary piece of self-reflection, while others saw it as an attempt to rewrite history. Either way, it sold widely and sparked discussions on both sides of the political spectrum. For Pam Bondi, the conclusion of the case against AOC was the beginning of a new phase of her career. She secured a seat in the Senate, where her rise was almost assured, and her victory in bringing down AOC was often used as a cornerstone of her political platform. But Bondi, despite the accolades and victories, also found herself haunted by the fallout. Though she had won the battle, the war over the political soul of the country was far from over. And as she took her place in the Senate, she had to contend with the fact that her victory had cost more than just AOC's career. It had sparked a national conversation about the lengths to which the system would go to maintain its power. Meanwhile, the nation continued to grapple with the broader questions raised by AOC's rise and fall. What did it mean to hold public officials accountable? Was it possible to balance justice with politics, or were the two inevitably at odds? The events surrounding AOC had prompted a deeper discussion about ethics, transparency, and the role of money in politics. But as quickly as the scandal had captured the nation's attention, the political machine moved on to the next controversy, the next headline, and the next scandal. And so, the political drama that had once centered on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez now faded into history. It was a story that would be told for generations to come, a cautionary tale of ambition, power, and the price of progress. Some would remember AOC as a martyr, others as a tragic figure undone by her own ambition, and still others as the embodiment of the political corruption she had once vowed to fight against. But in the end, AOC's story, like so many before her, was a story of both triumph and tragedy. A story of a young woman who had taken on the system, only to be swallowed by it. A story of a movement that had begun with great hope, but ended with the painful realization that in politics, change was never as simple as it seemed. Her legacy, though fractured, was not forgotten. In the years that followed, her name continued to resonate with those who fought for the causes she had championed, her ideas, her energy, and her tenacity still a beacon for those who sought a better future. But for AOC, the final chapter was one of quiet reflection. In the end, she had fought for what she believed in, and while she may have lost her place in the political world, her impact, for better or worse, would never be erased. And as the dust settled, one truth remained: the fight for change, no matter the outcome, was never truly over.